Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for having me today, and welcome to today's virtual Sadat Forum. Special thank you to today's speakers and to my colleague, Dr. Telhami, for bringing us together today. This past year has presented a set of challenges that we didn't expect, but we are facing them together. We are seeing some hope at this stage of the pandemic and are grappling with long-standing issues of racial injustice. These two pandemics have impacted us all in different ways, yet it has connected us in many other ways. The grand challenges and critical issues we continue to face make it even more important for our community to have events like the Sadat Forum. We need to continue having conversations on timely and current events like the topic of this year's forum, the Iran nuclear issue, which is one of the big early issues in the Biden administration is currently confronting. We could not have more distinguished and relevant panelists to take on this issue than our guest today. For more than 20 years, the Sadat Forum has brought internationally renowned leaders and experts in fields of international relations, diplomacy, security, and academia to the University of Maryland to discuss a range of pressing topics. It is often complemented by accompanying research through the University of Maryland's Critical Issues Poll, also directed by the Sadat professor Shibli Telhami. In fact, Professor Telhami will also discuss some recent findings from the latest poll on today's topic. Of course, the outstanding panelists assembled for the Sadat Forum normally get the opportunity to visit our beautiful campus. While this year's forum is virtual in nature, we embrace the fact that today we can accommodate a larger audience from across the nation and around the world safely. Today, I also have the pleasure of introducing my good friend, Dean Ball. Professor Gregory Ball has served as Dean of the College of Behavior and Social Sciences since 2014. Dean Ball joined the college with a commitment to excellence in teaching while working in the environment of a leading research university. We are aligned in this, as I stated my priorities as president are to promote excellence in everything that we do. This includes teaching and learning, research, innovation, the arts to athletics, and to create an inclusive multicultural campus environment. Excellence must be rooted in our values because what the university does matters. Dean Ball continues to support the Sadat Chair, the Critical Issues Poll, and the formation of the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement. Dean Ball is an active researcher himself in the field of behavioral neuroscience, and I'm proud to call him a colleague. Thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this treasured Sadat Forum on our campus. And now please welcome Dean Gregory Ball.
Thank you, President Pines, for your kind remarks and your kind introduction. I'm delighted to join you in welcoming our guests and our speakers and members of the University of Maryland community to attend this year's Sadat Forum. You know, as noted by President Pines, this forum has been one of the best platforms on this campus to bring together a variety of people thinking about issues of tremendous significance for foreign policy, international affairs, and its interface with domestic issues in the United States. The Sadat Chair is one of three peace chairs we have in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, which provides us with an unusual signature of scholars committed toward trying to understand things related to conflict, peace, and their resolution. One of the other notable chairs that's active today is the Baha'i Chair, headed by Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm delighted that this symposium has been able to continue in the virtual platform, and I hope all of you will enjoy it as it's structured today. As noted by President Pines, the topic of today could not be more timely. Biden and the Iran nuclear deal is one of the key foreign policy questions that is facing this new administration. It's which way it goes could have a tremendous impact in the future on whether we have conflicts in parts of this world. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Telhami. the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development in the Department of Government and Politics here at the University of Maryland, and Director of the Critical Issues Poll. Professor Telhami.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ball and Dr. Pines. It's really a pleasure for me to host this stellar panel to discuss our topic today. I will just introduce the panelists very briefly. I think they're well known to most of you. I'll just say a couple of things about each one, and then we'll get on with the conversation. First is my colleague, Suzanne Maloney, who is the Vice President of the Brookings Institution. She's also the Director of Foreign Policy. She had been a senior fellow there for many years. I've known her for a quarter century, really since she first arrived at Brookings, and has visited us at Maryland multiple times before, and we've collaborated on a number of projects. I will also say that Suzanne has advised various administrations on Iran, Republican and Democratic administration, and she has authored a number of books related to Iran, or edited. I'll just mention a couple of them. She edited The Iranian Revolution at 40. She authored Iran's Political Economy Since the Revolution, and Iran's Long Reach, among many others. She's been really prolific over the years. The next guest is Vali Nasser, who's also a friend of, I think we're talking about panelists who've known each other for decades in this particular case. Vali is the Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins. He's also the former dean of the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University, and has also advised the State Department on matters related to Middle Eastern issues. He's also been prolific. I will only mention a couple of his books, The Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in Retreat, and The Shia Revival, How Conflicts Within Islam Will Shape the Future. Next is Barbara Slavin, who's also been a friend for decades. Barbara is one of the prominent journalists who's covered the Middle East for many outfits, starting with The Economist, to USA Today, to the Washington Times, to Al Monitor, to the New York Times Week in Review. And I've encountered her in multiple places along the way when she was doing the interviewing, and now we turn around. So I'm really glad to have you all. I'm looking forward to the questions. I should add that at the moment, Barbara is the director of the Iran Initiative, a non-resident senior scholar at the Atlantic Council, obviously very much focused on this issue. And she also writes a column for Al Monitor. So let me start by just putting something on the table, and then ask each one of you a broad question. Obviously, the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was a signature deal of the Obama administration, the second Obama administration. And obviously, there's been a rupture in that when President Trump withdrew from that. It was obvious that Democrats opposed the Trump action universally and said they want to return to the JCPOA, as did a candidate, Joe Biden. And as president, he has said that as well since being elected president. And yet we're not there yet. It looks like it's far more complicated, at least the way it appears, than people have assumed. And I think that I want to put some issues on the table, because it looks like when we're thinking about the US return to the Iran nuclear deal, we're looking at several issues at once. One issue is America's credibility. Obviously, one of the things that is out there is an agreement that the US signed. And it's not just a bilateral agreement, it was an international agreement that obligated the US, from which the US unilaterally withdrew. And in a sense, that's an issue, particularly now facing the Biden administration broadly, about what they call restoring America's credibility in the face of America First and withdrawal from a lot of agreements and multilateral initiatives. And so there is this one issue, obviously, that in some ways obligates the administration in restoring credibility. The other is the obvious one, which is limiting Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons, which was what drove the agreement from the American side. And then the third is Iranian behavior in the region that bothers a lot of its neighbors, whether it's meddling in regional affairs or building conventional capabilities, especially missile capabilities. And all of that, of course, has taken place in a political environment at home here, where foreign policy isn't really a big issue. It is we're focused on so many huge issues, almost unprecedented issues that the president has to pass through and work with the Congress where the Democratic majority is limited. And this is obviously not a burning issue of the day, even though it is an issue that could draw the US into crisis, the only one really in the Middle East that could draw the US into a crisis. At the same time, we're coming up on an Iranian election where Iranian domestic politics come into play as well. So I want to just have this background to ask you each an opening question. Let me start with Suzanne. And Suzanne, just looking at it from where President Biden sits today, what does it look like? What are the options available to him? How does he see the urgency? What are the issues that he's now thinking about or considering as he's contemplating what to do about returning to the JCPOA?
Thanks so much, Shibli, and I'm really glad to be here again at the Sadat Forum and be part of this conversation on such an important issue. So I guess where I would start is that I think there was a bit of irrational exuberance about the prospects of a speedy return to the JCPOA by the United States. This was a talking point during the campaign period, and it was one that wasn't interrogated with a great deal of depth. There was just sort of unanimity among Democratic candidates during the primary, and then, of course, after now President Biden became the nominee, that a return to the Iran nuclear deal was a universal good. And that was, I think, a signal intended to be sent to America's allies that the United States under President Biden, under any Democratic president, was going to be back in the business of real diplomacy. But it was always clear, I think, to anyone who understood the details of the deal, and particularly the sequencing of events that transpired after President Trump withdrew the United States from the deal, and particularly after in May of 2019, he began escalating economic pressure on Iran to try to bring Iran's oil exports down to zero. That this was always going to be a fairly complicated dance between the two parties because the Iranians, as of May of 2019, began to roll back their own compliance with the deal, and of course also began to undertake a series of actions in the Gulf and across the region that helped bring the United States and Iran to the brink of war in January of 2020. That war didn't happen, but we are still left, I think, with the aftermath of an escalation which hasn't really been rolled back on either side, and with a standoff between the two as to exactly how to proceed. Both sides apparently want some return to the general bargain that existed under the deal, which is that Iran would receive some sanctions relief from the United States and the world, and in return it would submit to greater scrutiny and restrictions and restraints on its nuclear activities. There's, I think, a common interest in that, both in Tehran and in Washington today, but how do you get there? That's the short-term priority. How do you sequence who goes first and exactly what series of steps are undertaken? If that was the only problem, I wouldn't be terribly worried. But I think there are a host of other problems, one of which you mentioned, which is that the Biden administration, the context is totally different today than it was in 2013 when Obama started negotiating the deal, or in 2016 when the deal went into implementation. There are just other much more urgent priorities facing the Biden administration on the domestic front with respect to the pandemic, with respect to concern about racial justice, with respect to the climate crisis, but also, of course, on the international front in terms of the relative position between the United States and China. And so you have that set of issues that you just can't simply devote the time and attention of the Secretary of State, as John Kerry did back in 2015 during the final months of the deal, to try to hammer something out. There are just bigger issues on the table. The other issues are that, you know, we are within reach of the expiration of some of the restrictions under the deal during President Biden's first term. And so whatever he does now, he's got to be looking toward what happens in 2 years as some of the restrictions begin to expire. How does he go into potentially a re-election campaign with that looming over him if he rushed back to the deal? And there is this overarching problem that I think no one within the administration has fully grappled with yet, which is that the logic of the Iran nuclear deal was predicated on this presumption that somehow, even if it wasn't directly linked, that some kind of an arrangement on the nuclear issue could lead to an amelioration of the other issues of concern with respect to Iran. Didn't happen. It's not going to happen. No realistic assessment of Iran today would hold that it would happen. And in fact, no one in this administration has suggested that they believe it could happen. And so how do you deal with the nuclear issue in a way that does not subordinate or sacrifice the other issues of concern with respect to Iran? All that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a fully staffed national security bureaucracy, which we don't yet have, with key people who have yet to be confirmed at the State Department, the Pentagon, and elsewhere. So irrational exuberance at the start. I think there's still plenty of time to deal with this, and I think the Biden administration is approaching it in exactly the right way.
Shibli, you're muted. You're muted. Unmute yourself.
The moderator is muting himself. I'm going to turn to Vali now, but please don't limit yourself to my question. If you want to engage what any of the other panelists said, feel free to do so. But Vali, I want to actually ask you about what it might look like now to Tehran. Suzanne anyway described how the Biden administration sees it, how it finds itself right now in facing this issue. What about if you were to put yourself in the position of the Iranian leadership as they're contemplating what to do in their relationship with the U.S. and in terms of return to JCPOA? What does it look like for them?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel of friends. It's really great to be on this panel with Suzanne and Barbara, and to be at the University of Maryland. I think, looking at what Suzanne described, the Iranians perhaps did not read the tea leaves the same way as she laid it out. During the campaign, their expectation was that there would be a much clearer break between the Biden foreign policy and the Trump foreign policy. I don't want to say they were naive, but they did not expect the same degree of continuity that has happened. At least their expectation was that there would be more clear signals about going back to the deal, or that the United States would make its intentions known. And even if it doesn't go fully back in the deal, that there would be much more of a clear understanding of a compliance for compliance. I think Suzanne is right that the Iran issue is not as a great urgency for the administration. I think that's very clear to Tehran, that I think that the United States obviously does not take Iran's nuclear program seriously enough to take any risks with Congress, or to put any political capital in doing anything that is risky. So then the danger, if I were to sort of read the way they might look at it, is that how do you make the Iran issue much more urgent for the president? And that actually means a sort of a set of negative incentives, which Suzanne mentioned, already began to play out after 2019, when a year of waiting for the Europeans to do something about maximum pressure didn't work. and the President Trump said we're going to go back to zero. So the Iranians basically began to put pressure on the U.S. through varieties of activities. I think we're in that cycle. So they're now accelerating enrichment. The Supreme Leader is talking about 60% enrichment. Iran's Minister of Intelligence hints at going beyond the fatwa of the Supreme Leader to build the bomb. And then, attacks in Yemen have increased. In Afghanistan, there are negative signals we're seeing. In Syria, negative signals we're seeing. So that's a strategy of essentially making Iran much more of a high priority. And then I think the Iranians now sort of think that the structure of this conversation has changed. At the beginning, it was about compliance for compliance. That terminology was used even in the op-ed. I think President Biden wrote in CNN. Now, Suzanne's correct. Who takes the first step? What are the sequences? All of that still would be out there. But I think Tehran's sense is that actually the administration is no longer really interested in JCPOA. It's interested in a different deal, what they call the longer, stronger deal. And even if in the language of people in the administration, they hardly refer to JCPOA. They say that their goal is to put Iran's nuclear program under strict confinements, which means the goal is more important than the deal. And if this deal, as Suzanne said, is not going to achieve that, and I don't see how JCPOA actually can be implementable post-2023, because in the best circumstances, United States would have had to ratify JCPOA by 2023, and Iran would have had to ratify the additional protocol. I think even if they go back in the deal, they both could potentially be out of compliance in 2023. So if the administration is already negotiating the next deal, and the Iranians, I think, have come to the conclusion that there might be some relief in the short run in exchange for better behavior by Iran, but that they have to prepare themselves for the next deal. And that basically means you have to have a lot more stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. You have to put the pressure on Yemen, on Syria, on Afghanistan. You have to elect a unified, conservative, hardline leadership in Iran to create a united front, all of which would mean it's going to be very difficult. I agree with all the conclusions Suzanne said. The president has basically a no-win scenario. This is what he inherited from Trump and his departure from the nuclear deal. So you're in a situation, there is risk going back in soon, because then the Iranians may not agree to a follow-on, but the longer you wait, this can also become a much bigger problem and keep climbing up the list of urgencies. And so how do you balance managing this without actually giving Iran, either having to go into conflict to stop a breakout in Iran, or that find a way to get them to the table? I think we're in a sort of a difficult place where there's no obvious path forward.
Yeah, and this actually, I'm going to come back to that, because I think there are risks to kind of postponing, and there are risks to moving quickly, and that those have to be weighed, and we have to articulate those. I want to come back to that question, but I want to turn to Barbara, partly on the question of credibility. I mean, Iran watched, they signed an agreement, they thought it was final. An American president unilaterally pulled out, and now it seems like the U.S. wants to renegotiate a deal. How much faith can they put in it, even if they can reach a deal, that this is not going to happen again? I mean, it's one of the questions that I think Iran would have to consider. But looking at it from the point of view of the U.S. partners, or at least the other international players in the agreement, this is not just an American agreement, it's an international agreement with Iran. And obviously, it obligates a number of permanent members of the Security Council, Germany. And how does that play out there? I mean, we're looking at it from, the European capitals, put aside China for now. They had certain expectations, perhaps like Vali said, very similar to where the Iran expectations were about Biden. And what they're seeing now is something they're trying to figure out what they're seeing. They're not exactly recognizing. So what does that look to them right now?
First of all, thank you very much also for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to see familiar faces and my former sources when I was in my journalist days. You know, it's been a very depressing couple of months, I have to say, because I had definitely higher expectations, a little bit of irrational exuberance, to use Suzanne's terminology. And I really thought the Europeans could smooth the way for a return to compliance on both sides in a way that, you know, Europe has proven not able to do, frankly. Obviously, they are absorbed with COVID, and just as everyone is, and they were really waiting, I think, to take their cues from the Biden administration. That said, I think that the path forward still is a return to the JCPOA and then a discussion about a follow-on. I don't think there is any way to jump over that. And I think that that's what the Biden team is learning. I think the Iranians have made it very clear. And that the reluctance on the part of the Iranians to come to a meeting hosted by the European Union's High Representative maybe because they want to make sure that there is an understanding on the Biden side that there has to be a return. Even if there are issues that will come up in 2023, I mean, the agreement, if it were to be restored, would prevent Iran from having enough fissile material for a single weapon until the beginning of the year 2031. Which would be an enormous relief, I think, to many of us who are concerned about that growing stockpile of 20% uranium. So I think this is a point that has to be made clear. The question, though, and Vali raised it, is whether there is now still an appetite in Iran to come back in. Clearly, Hassan Rouhani, the president, and Javad Zarif would like a resurrection of the JCPOA. It is their legacy more than anything. But they understand that in you know, after Nowruz in a few weeks, we're going to be full on into the presidential campaign, and they are on their way out. They are lame ducks. So it's a tricky time. I haven't given up hope. I think that there is a lot going on behind the scenes. One of the reasons we're not hearing about it is because of our domestic politics. And I was in a bakery, a local bakery recently, ran into one of our negotiators, I won't say which one, and I said, what's going on? And he said, Menendez. And just today, Senator Menendez, who chairs the committee, Foreign Relations Committee, released a joint letter with Lindsey Graham, basically asking for a JCPOA plus. It's something I think that APEC has been supporting. So this is Menendez's position, and the administration needs every Democratic vote, not just to get its nominations through, its nominees, but for everything, whether it's COVID, whether it's voting rights, infrastructure. So this is a reality in the United States. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're not hearing a lot more, and why the talking points are very boring and repetitious and cautious. So we still have, look, you know, the new government doesn't take over in Iran, the new administration, until August. So there is still some months ahead, and I'm not giving up yet.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up the letter by Menendez and Lindsey Graham, and I'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about politics. But it's also a reminder that even Obama had pushback from Democratic Senate. Remember, Schumer voted against the JCPOA. So this is, you know, kind of when it enters into our politics, it's not clear that you're going to have, you know, kind of a consensus on this among Democrats. I'm talking about. So, and then this is obviously a first shot fired in that. But that brings me. I want to bring in an element that I want to just introduce, and then I want to come back to Suzanne with a question about it. You know, we talked about sort of how Iranians see it, how Biden might see it, how the international community might see it. Remember, of course, Some of the key drivers in all this are the Middle Eastern players, particularly Gulf Arab states and Israel. And obviously they were opposed to the JCPOA from the beginning and applauded Trump withdrawal from the JCPOA. While the Arab states ultimately came to approve it once Obama reached the agreement, they were pushing against it. The Israelis never really warmed up to it. The question is, how do they see it right now? Because they are players, not only, of course, in terms of what happens in the region and the possible escalation and crises that might emerge that could draw the U.S. in, which is what Obama started with, but also in terms of playing into our own politics, how that plays out ultimately in our politics. And for now, obviously, the Arab partners and Israel have been in favor of maintaining maximum pressure for different reasons. And I've argued this before, that Israel and Gulf Arab states don't have the same priorities. Israel has focused entirely on the nuclear issue early on, which is what drove Obama to make that a priority issue. He feared that this could draw the US into a war or conflict or some crisis with Iran he didn't want. And clearly, after the then Israeli prime minister, who's still prime minister, Netanyahu, argued that the nuclear bomb is around the corner, if you recall, at the UN and elsewhere. Obama focused entirely on the nuclear issue, whereas the Arab states were mostly worried about Iranian behavior in the region, meddling in Arab affairs, conventional weapons, the weakening of the strengthening of Iran after the Iraq war that they have opposed in 2003, the fact that Iran has emerged as a conventional power in a way that they lacked confronting. So their calculus is really not identical to the Israelis. They both want to contain Iran. They both want to limit Iranian power. But the Obama administration focused on the Israeli worries at the time, which was the nuclear issue. And now I'm not sure that Arab states are as focused on the nuclear issue. We've seen Suzanne was there. She co-hosted a big conference on the Middle East a couple of weeks ago. I interviewed the former Minister of State Foreign Affairs of the UAE. There were UAE think tankers who said, nuclear weapons are deterrence weapons. We're not worried about that as much. And we're worried about what Iran does behaviorally. So you have those two issues on the one hand, the issue of Iranian behavior that is independent from the nuclear issue, and you have the focus on the nuclear issue. And it's interesting that the Israelis, in a way, seems to have drawn a lesson from the focus on the nuclear issue last time, because now they seem to think there's no urgency. Because in 2000, look back at 2013, 2014, 2015, during the Obama administration, it was all about the nuclear urgency. Iran is just about to have in 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, Iran's about to have nuclear weapons. Now the Israelis say there's no urgency. So it is interesting to think about that, Suzanne, so then how does that play, how do the priorities of Gulf Arab states and Israel play into our calculus, our politics, as well as our calculus in decision making?
Yeah, I think you point out an interesting divergence between the regional environment as it is today and as it was in the run-up to the nuclear deal. There are big differences, of course, that help to explain this. I mean, one of the reasons why there was such a vociferous reaction to the Obama era negotiations was that they took at least the Israelis and other U.S. partners in the region by some surprise. And the extent to which an interim deal was negotiated without as much interaction and briefing and foreknowledge of some of our closest partners in the region, I think was probably one of the steps that we'll see the Biden administration approach in a very different way, simply to try to avert some of the instinctive knee-jerk opposition. I think the other piece of it, of course, is that, you know, we have an extant deal and we know what the terms of that deal is, and the Israelis and others in the region don't find it satisfactory. And so what we see is, I think, not, you know, a lack of urgency about Iran's nuclear ambitions. Everyone I have ever spoken to in Israel and the Gulf is, you know, fairly well convinced that Iran intends to acquire the capacity for nuclear weapons, that there is, you know, really no other explanation for the program as we know it exists. And there's been an enormous amount of corroborating material that's come out of the archives that were spirited out of Tehran by Mossad, as well as other documentation by the IAEA about the nature of the Iranian program. But the reason for a different tone that you're hearing from the Israelis as well as others in the region, I think, reflects the sense that if the Biden administration jumps back to the JCPOA, that will be the end of any serious prospect of negotiating with the Iranians on anything. And so you are left with only coercive measures to deal with the rest of the concerns that we have about Iran's activity across the region and, of course, toward its own population. And I think that's a very realistic assumption. I mean, this idea that, you know, we go back to the nuclear deal and then we find a way to sit down and, you know, hammer out something that actually addresses missiles or something else, it's just inconceivable to me, because I think once Tehran gets the sanctions relief that it had under the JCPOA, there's really no incentive for this leadership to come to any other agreement. If it were a leadership that truly cared about Iran's economic development and wanted a country that was fully integrated in the world economy, that had, you know, deep and abiding connections with cultural and political organizations around the world, then sure, a full opening, a full rapprochement would be the objective, and there might be room for negotiation. But what we know from 42 years is that that is not the objective of this leadership in Tehran. What they want is self-preservation, and self-preservation requires some engagement with the international financial system, but it does not, in fact, it abhors any true rapprochement or any real opening to Western business and the transparency and the accountability that it would require. And so, you know, the JCPOA is just good enough to get Tehran what it wants. That's why they agreed to the deal in 2015. That's why the Supreme Leader blessed it at the time, despite his own longstanding mistrust of Washington and anti-American sentiment. And I think that the reason why you hear a different song coming out of the region is simply the sense of realism. If we move back to the JCPOA, there is nothing more that can be done through negotiations. We will have sacrificed all the leverage that we have.
Yeah, and Vali and Barbara, if you want to weigh in on this broad question, but I also want to add to it in thinking about sort of the possibilities. We had a question from Adam Lucente from Al Monitor about this specific letter that Barbara referred to from Menendez and Lindsey Graham, who called for something to sort of get a new agreement in a way that makes it impossible for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, as well as limit Iranian action in the region. I wonder, what is the assessment of the likelihood of anything along these lines, Vali? But feel free to reflect on the same issues that we were discussing earlier as well.
Well, I mean, the idea of a broader deal, particularly if it's going to involve regional issues, et cetera, is in a way basically no deal at this point in time. I mean, I think even the very first time when US and Iran sat together, the most urgent issue for both sides bubbled up to the top. And for the US, it was the nuclear issue, because that was the most likely reason that President Obama might have ended up in another war in the region. That doesn't mean that the other issues didn't matter, but the idea that everything would be on the table, it basically means that nothing will eventually get done. It's a good goal to have, but I'm not sure it's a good diplomatic strategy to have go forward. To add a few points to what Suzanne said, I mean, one of the issues in the region is that it's not very clear the United States wants to leave and is leaving. I mean, this idea started by President Obama with Pivot to Asia. President Trump was very convincing on taking Iran on, but I don't think he ever convinced the Persian Gulf Emirates, monarchies, et cetera, that it actually was going to stay in the region long term. He wanted them to pay for their security. He wanted to talk to Iran at some days of the week. He started whittling down troops in Afghanistan, in Syria, the like, and also for all the reasons that Suzanne said at the beginning, the urgencies that President Biden is facing, plus the escalation with China, it suggests that the United States ultimately wants to lower the importance of the Middle East to its foreign policy priorities. So that's an important psychological issue in the middle of all of this. Now, I always thought that the nuclear issue for Iran is really about the United States. It's really about creating the military front, the deterrence against regime change in Tehran. And then also it's a bargaining issue to get Iran engaged in the global economy to whatever extent it's possible. So that was actually the bargain at JCPOA. It was not about normalization. It was about reduction of sanctions in exchange for Iran, capping its nuclear program. And the nuclear issue until now is not material to Iran's regional ambitions. It's not something that really fits into their defense against Israel right now, or defense against Saudi Arabia, or whatever ambitions or anxieties they may have in the region. So what matters to the regional balance of power is conventional weaponry and conventional capabilities. And there, Iran's Air Force belongs in a museum. They've invested in missiles instead. They use proxies essentially as missile systems of another kind. And so we forget that, the JCPOA finished with the United States giving huge amount of weaponry to Saudi Arabia and UAE, and even if we set Israel aside. So it actually, what they wanted from the United States at that point was a security pact, a guarantee that if you're cutting this deal, that you would sign a pact with us, that you would defend us against any kind of Iranian aggression. President Obama's answer was, I'll give you all the weapons you want, but you're pretty much on your own. And of course, they would see any kind of an American deal with Iran, which is just basically an exit ticket for the United States, as extremely dangerous for them. And the reason I don't think what Menendez and Graham want works is because the missiles and proxies ultimately are an arms control issue at a regional level. I mean, it's very difficult, however much sanctions you put on Iran, if you're selling F-35s to UAE and Reaper missiles and everything else, that you also would ask them to give weaponry up. And of course, UAE and Saudi Arabia would want exactly that the US basically negotiates the balance of power in the region. But tying those things to the nuclear issue essentially makes it too big. And I don't see a pathway right now with missiles and proxies, largely because there's not a minimum of a security relationship in the region. And the Persian Gulf Emirates, as I said, let's even put Israel, which is a much more difficult issue, aside, are not engaged in any kind of a de-escalation or a security conversation with Iran. There's no even basis for an arms control agreement, for instance, on maximum range of missiles in the region. I'm not saying the Iranians would necessarily abide by it or agree to it, but there's not even a way to even have these conversations. And so I think, again, when we sit down and see what is the most urgent thing this administration is going to focus on, it's going to be the nuclear issue. The best they can get to is a better deal, but lumping in all the security issues of the region does not make sense. And if there are lessons learned from JCPOA, in my opinion, it's not just that how the Iranians took the JCPOA and ran with it. It's what did the United States do day after with its allies? It did maximum amount to actually feel them more insecure by giving them no guarantees and rather investing in arms race in the region. And I think if we get to a deal, we should sort of be very careful about what do we communicate to our allies about what happens day after a deal.
So with that, I mean, obviously the fact that these issues are connected is a huge issue. That is, when you talk about the Iranian missile program, then you're going to talk about the regional issue, the regional arms race and so forth. But even aside from that, I mean, if you're thinking about Iran, I would let me put a hypothesis on the table and ask you if you agree or disagree with it, that Iran is more likely to accept limits on nuclear program than it is on its missile program.
No, I agree, and it's not going to accept limits on its proxies either. These proxies essentially are an offensive weapon and a defensive weapon. They're part of Iran's strategic arsenal. If you took the missiles and proxies away from Iran, what does it exactly have in terms of technological competition with Israel or Saudi Arabia, UAE? As I said, it doesn't. Its air force belongs in a museum. It actually cannot compete. So that does not mean that it's a friendly regime. I'm just saying that the hard military minds in Iran are sort of think of what are their assets in terms of projection of military power, and why they may look at the nuclear issue differently than they do on the regional issues and on the missile issues.
And Barbara, I mean, on this theme of how they might see these priorities, bring in the upcoming Iranian elections. And you can make an argument that they really don't matter at all for the calculus, and you can make an argument that they do, and I've heard it both ways. So where do you fall on that?
Yeah. Well, look, unfortunately, the Iranians have not seen fit to give me a visa since 2013. So what I'm about to tell you comes from analysts there who I trust. And there is a sense, I mean, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, will pass from the scene eventually, and he's very focused on his succession and a desire to have sort of all the organs of power very much consolidated behind one view. I doubt this will happen. This is Iran, and it's one of the most fractious places I've ever covered. But anyway, this is the dream that somehow it will become united behind one particular point of view. No, I mean, look, if I think whether it's with Rouhani or his successor with Zarif or Zarif's successor, I think there is a desire to get sanctions lifted and a willingness to return to the original JCPOA. Beyond that, and in my discussions with administration officials, they say, look, if we want to talk about renegotiating the JCPOA, the nuclear terms, that's a discussion for Iran and the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council in Germany. If we want to talk about regional issues, that's a different group of players. And the GCC can't even get its act together. It's just barely overcome its boycott of Qatar. So to think you could bring the GCC together in some sort of unified position, and then under UN auspices, something like that, with the Security Council supporting it, have some sort of regional discussion, an OSCE, a HOPE initiative, as the Iranians have proposed. I think it's a leap too far. And that the best one could hope for might be some small confidence building measures. I mean, if the Saudis are willing to have some back channel dialogue with Iran over Yemen, that kind of thing. These kinds of de-escalatory steps are possible. One other thing we do need to bring in, and that is, I think the Biden administration, maybe it's not looking for the exits yet from the region entirely, but at his press conference today, Joe Biden was asked about Afghanistan, and he said, well, maybe we won't make the May 1 deadline for removing US troops, but he was asked, are they still going to be there a year from now? And he said no. So if the US is intent on getting out of Afghanistan within this next year, it would be helpful to have at least a de-escalatory process in effect with Iran, which has a lot of influence over what happens in Afghanistan, as well as Yemen, as well as Syria, as well as Iraq, as well as Lebanon. So I still think that the goal should be a return to the JCPOA, and then whatever else you can do is fine, but at least stop the escalation of the nuclear program and hopefully stop the escalation of other things that we're seeing in the region that are not in the interests of the United States and not in the interests of US allies.
Let me add, by the way, while we have the opportunity, when we're talking about the Iranian election, that there will be an event on April 17th at the University of Maryland that's going to be hosted by the Rashan Institute for Persian Studies, that's going to focus on the Iranian elections and also their possible consequences for this issue as well. But I want to just raise a couple of more questions first, and then I want to end with a round about the risks. Let me raise this question with Suzanne. Particularly, Suzanne is a real expert on the economics of the region, of the Gulf region broadly, but especially Iran, and the strategy of so-called maximum pressure. And obviously, there's been a consensus, at least among Democrats and among, I think, the public policy elites, that maximum pressure has failed, at least to dissuade Iran from pursuing the policies that it does. And by the way, in a poll that we did recently, so in the Middle East Scholar Barometer that I do with Mark Lynch, of Middle East scholars, members of the American Political Science Association, who specialize in the Middle East, and members of the Middle East Studies Association, people who thought that maximum pressure works are in minuscule, in this lower single digit. So there is a little bit of a consensus that it doesn't work. But yet, I think there are still people who think it will. And obviously the default, I mean, if we don't have a new agreement, if there's no return to JCPOA, the status quo is maximum pressure. And that's what we have. So I wonder, Suzanne, how you see the relationship between this pressure from the outside. Obviously, Iran has paid a heavy price for maximum pressure, but has it in many ways, in any way, significant way, affect the way they do business in the region or the policy toward the nuclear issue?
Look, I think it's tough to make an argument that maximum pressure succeeded, because what we see is an Iran that is moving closer to nuclear weapons capability, not further from it. We do not see significant ameliorative effects on Iran's activity around the region, and certainly we don't see any improvement in Iran's treatment of its own population and adherence to basic standards of human and civil rights. So I don't think that there's a case that maximum pressure works. I also don't think we're in a maximum pressure situation any longer, because, you know, whether, irrespective of the language coming out of the Biden administration, the world, and in particular Beijing, has made a calculation that there is not going to be the same level of risk of enforcement of the sanctions that might have existed under the Trump administration. And so, you know, some of the estimates about the volume of Iranian exports are upwards of more than 1 million barrels a day, much of which is going to China, all under, you know, sort of false flags. So, you know, the Iranians, that may not help the Iranian bottom line as much as they'd like, because it's still complicated for them to repatriate foreign exchange, but it does provide a cushion effect, and it does essentially mitigate any real effort to try to use economic pressure to drive change with Iran. I think that was always a mistake on the part of the Trump administration. Sanctions became an end unto themselves. We have found that they are more durable than many anticipated. If you recall back in 2018, when Trump left the deal, there were a lot of supporters of the deal who said, well, it won't matter because the rest of the world won't go along with these measures. In fact, the rest of the world had to go along to a certain extent with the measures. And so we know sanctions can have an economic effect, but the challenge is that they don't always have the political effect. They don't change the policy the way that you would intend. I think, the aspect of Trump policy that would be more worthwhile for the Biden administration to retain is not this commitment to the very far-reaching sanctions that were imposed by the Trump administration, but rather the readiness to push back on Iran across the region. And I share the kind of skepticism that there's a broader deal to be had with the Iranians now or at any point. I think there's actually it would be problematic to try to get into a negotiation between the United States and Iran on one another's regional presence. That's not a conversation we ought to be having with the Iranians. But what I do think we have to be doing is centering whatever we're doing around the nuclear issue in a broader policy, which is coordinated with partners and allies in the region and in Europe and elsewhere, that takes seriously and does not hold hostage to the nuclear deal the other array of concerns, particularly what Iran is doing in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. Other issues, including the fate of dual nationals and other foreign nationals who are held by Iran explicitly as bargaining chips, as means of expanding its own leverage in negotiations. We have to have a coordinated strategy on all these issues, and we have to be ready to push back. I think it was quite positive, even if it was very limited, to see Biden strike at Iranian-backed troops in Syria. And I think that we have to demonstrate that as Iran escalates its own behavior in the region through its proxies or even directly, as we now are seeing in this kind of shadow war with the Israelis, that the United States isn't going to simply sit on the sidelines. I don't think that drags us into war. I think that Iran can and will be deterred. It was deterred after the assassination of Soleimani. We did not see the level of escalation that many people predicted, the level of retaliation that many people predicted. And I think that we have to be prepared to push back, even as we're using diplomacy to try to address some other aspects of the Iranian challenge.
So Valerie, to follow up a little bit on this, but looking at it from the Iranian side again, the sort of what drives, how do we decide how they prioritize? One argument, and it might go along with what Suzanne said, is that it's defensive, that's relatively conservative, and there are arguments to be made for defensive argument about threats that they feel. But there's also an argument that many of its neighbors make that the regime is inherently interventionist by virtue of it being an Islamist regime, that is built into the nature of the regime itself. And obviously that's why you've had people say regime change. So I wonder how you make that assessment about sort of how they do prioritizing when they are making decisions about national security.
Well, I think at some level, whether it's defensive or offensive becomes immaterial. I mean, entire empires have been built on the back of defensive issues. So what might have started as defense, now you gradually get the taste of presence, you use it again, it becomes offensive, and largely you end up even creating institutions and structures that then can basically are motivated on their own. I would say that, I wouldn't say that Iran actually feels completely secure in its skin. I mean, it's not that it's not afraid of the United States or is not afraid of Israel, or that the regime feels completely secure and in position. So it does have vulnerabilities. There's no question about it. Now, whether they're making the right decisions about these, that's debatable. The key question is that what is it that the United States wants to ask of Iran as the top priority, in exchange for which it's going to give Iran what is Iran's biggest ask, right? Now, if Iran, as Suzanne said, for reasons of regime survival, needs X degree of access to international community, what is Iran going to give in order to get that? And I don't think we have an infinite list of things we can ask Iran. I mean, President Obama made the decision that capping Iran's nuclear program is the most important thing. But I think the dilemma the administration has is that as it sort of gets ready to go in, a host of others begin to say that my issue is the top priority issue, or that has to be added on. And I don't disagree at all with that. All of the issues that was put on the table that are problems with Iran, but in a sense, the dilemma of in the next 2-3 years of negotiations with Iran is that we have to prioritize. What's the top issue? You know, what is it that we want from them most urgently as step one, and what is it that they want, and make that barter going forward. Now, what you asked, which is an interesting question, that you know, is Iran's also vulnerabilities and ambitions changing in the context of things that are happening, right? So, you know, to Suzanne's point, Iran did do something after Soleimani's killing, which was pretty dangerous. I mean, at least according to CBS, you know, it was a miracle that more Americans were not killed with that attack on Ain al-Assad. My assumption was that that was intentional, but apparently it was luck. But she's right. After that, they laid low and they basically were deterred, which means that they do have these fears. So we have to sort of calibrate what is it that we want from them, what we're willing to give. But at the same time, you know, there's some onus on the region to also think along the same ways. So what is it that Saudi Arabia can give and get from Iran, or UAE can give and get from Iran? I mean, current assumption they have is that there's nothing. There's nothing that we can give them that would get them to do something better. And I think that in some ways to me is not credible, because they're putting all the onus on the United States to solve all the problems of the region. But, you know, that's also has to be tested.
Yeah, so let me turn to Barbara to add to this. Before I do, I want to do a final round to bring it back to Biden's option and the risks that are entailed in action versus non-action. But Barbara can add to what Vali and Suzanne said.
Look, in terms of the region, you know, these countries have worked together before. There was a security agreement between the late King Abdullah and the Iranians when Khatami was president, when Hassan Rouhani was the national security advisor, on sort of a non-subversion pact that the Saudis would not stir up Sunni and Arab militants in Iran, in return for which Iran would keep its hands off Saudi Arabia and not provoke the Shia there. This was after the Khobar Towers attack of 1996 that killed a number of American airmen. So that détente lasted really quite a long time, until in the aftermath of the US invasion of Iraq. I mean, we shifted the sectarian balance and the balance of power in the region by getting rid of Saddam after getting rid of the Taliban. And of course, Iran was able to intervene very effectively after the Arab Spring in Syria. But it's a complicated picture. You know, a lot of these countries are failed states. Yemen, Syria, Lebanon are in terrible shape. Iraq is not in very good shape either. And so Iran may enjoy the influence, but I'm not sure it enjoys the economic burden. And it doesn't look like it's going to be a while before they can profit in any way from Syria, for example, which is absolutely bankrupt now. I think if the region, you know, there's still money in the UAE, still not as much in Saudi Arabia as there used to be, but there could be a conversation about stabilizing some of these places. But, you know, the Saudis have to be willing to sit down. I think the Emiratis would do that. Certainly Oman and Kuwait, Qatar have relationships with Iran and could be part of such a discussion. And the US could encourage it. Europeans could encourage it. The UN could encourage it. But I'll go back. I don't want to be a broken record, but the first step is to go back to the JCPOA. Whatever its flaws, whatever its limitations, it showed that it was possible to reach an agreement with Iran that the Iranians would implement. It was sanctified in a UN Security Council resolution. It was an achievement for the Europeans. It was an achievement for the United States, Russia, and China, which don't normally work together. And if that cannot be put back together, if we can't go back to that, I just think it's going to be very, very difficult to deal with any of these other very pressing concerns. And I share Suzanne's concerns about the dual nationals, about Siamak Namazi, held over 5 years, Bakr Namazi, 84 years old, you know, the environmentalists who are being held. This is horrible. And I had hoped that we could begin with some of these questions. I thought also that the Biden administration could make some gestures on the humanitarian front because of COVID, allowing Iran access to frozen funds in places like South Korea for humanitarian trade. And it's mystifying to me that the Biden administration did not do more. So I blame Biden really and his people, for whatever reason, for not being a little bit more proactive. I think we could have avoided the situation we're in now, where we're staring at each other and, you know, Tony Blinken is saying, oh, the ball is in Iran's court. I mean, this is juvenile and it's not helpful.
Well, perhaps, but you know, posturing is part of negotiations. So I mean, it's for looks domestically. Whether they're doing it, you got to do this first. We got to do this first. That's part of negotiations. That bothers me less as a posture. It's just a question of what kind of signal are you sending behind the scenes about what you're prepared to do. But I want to go with the final round of questions to you all, and it's really about where we are left. Maximum pressure doesn't work, has not worked, doesn't work. The Biden administration has so many priorities right now that it doesn't want to take this issue on politically, immediately, because there's no urgency for it given all the other urgencies. And so we go on kind of this posturing period of, and every day it gets harder to get back to the deal. It doesn't get easier. If you see this letter, obviously, that Barbara mentioned, is an example of the sort of things that will mount as you go through. So there is a risk, political risk for the administration if it pushes to go back immediately, but other risk even higher if it doesn't go back to the agreement. Not only because it becomes harder to go back to the agreement, but here's the thing, it's a dynamic relationship. So obviously, how are the Iranians going to respond to maximum pressure, continuation maximum pressure? They're going to escalate the sort of things that Vali talked about, which is perhaps enriching more uranium, perhaps meddling more to make the point. And at some point, that's going to generate even more pressure from within the administration to do something about Iran, and to be more hardline on the position on Iran. And it might even reach a point where there's a crisis, whether it's between Israel and Iran in terms of what might develop, or between Iran and its Arab neighbors. So at some point, there could be a crisis, because you can't imagine this going on indefinitely, that could draw back the administration. How likely is that, Suzanne? I mean, so looking at it from, weighing in the risks of, going in quickly and then picking up the pieces and try to create a forum to talk about other issues versus waiting, and then it becomes more costly domestically as well as more risky internationally.
I guess I don't see the binary there. What I see is the administration prepared to talk. It hasn't yet panned out, but that isn't to say that it won't or that it can't. It also isn't to say that there's plenty of communication that happens between the United States government and the Iranian government, even at the worst moments, even throughout the Trump administration. So I can only assume that there may be communication ongoing now between Iranian diplomats and Americans, if only through third-party interlocutors. So, I think diplomacy works best when it's patient, when it's not frantic. The Iranians will try to provoke a crisis. We know this from their long track record of doing so. They will also take steps like seizing innocents as a means of trying to pressure the international community, essentially for extortion purposes. We can't take that bait, and we have to be prepared to try to get the best possible agreement with Iran with respect to its nuclear program. And we have to be building toward a multilateral strategy of deterring and containing Iran's destabilizing activity across the region. And as a wonderful essay out today by Karim Sajidpour details, standing for human rights in Iran, a position that frankly has never been a strong suit for any American administration and is more relevant today than it's ever been. So creating the tunnel, as he describes, toward a better future for Iran. It's not regime change, but it is holding this regime to a very high standard in terms of its crimes against its own people. And that, I think, the combination of those three things, trying to find a diplomatic resolution where possible, trying to create a multilateral coalition around some of the other issues of concern about Iran's policies, and really helping slowly, steadily to build support for a better future for Iran that would be devised by Iranians. That's a very reasonable and I hope successful approach to Iran by the United States. And I think that's what nothing that I've seen the Biden administration do to date in any way contradicts that.
Vali, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think, the one question the administration has to ask going forward is what is its capacity for dealing with the Middle East and with Iran? Some of the issues requires significant dedication of time and material and diplomatic resources, bartering with Russia and China over things that they want in order to get the ducks in a row. So I think that's a decision that has to be done internally. How much does this matter, right? And how much resources is this administration, given everything else it has, wants to dedicate to this? The second question is, how do they see this ending? I think there is, obviously they think that it can have a good ending. They keep saying, well, Iran will get back to the table and it will end up where we want. But that's a risk. In other words, this may not end where we want. It may end up becoming a much larger problem that one president kicks down to another one, like North Korea. Iran can go down a much, much worse path internally than even the one that Suzanne was describing. We saw under Saddam Hussein that it ultimately took an invasion in order to move things around. So it's not a given that it moves forward. Secondly, I think for the Iranians, the issue is not talking. Talking doesn't get them relief. In other words, the worst fear they have is going in a room where basically they give up that one leverage they have of talking, and nothing happens, and they come out of the room, and still they're under the same degree of sanctions. I would have thought it would have been more optimal for the US to actually stabilize the situation. And that would have meant that it would have basically not necessarily taken all the sanctions off, but they would have taken some steps that would have created a greater commitment by the Iranians, or belief by the Iranians that this process does not require additional escalation going forward. So at some point, there's a chance of miscalculations. The Iranians can cross a line that ultimately will force this administration to go back in. And the idea that we can keep pressuring Iran without any safety, but that there's no risk involved in this, and we're going to get somewhere we are. I hope that they're correct, but if the worry I have is that the risk factor keeps getting higher and higher.
Barbara, you have the last word.
Okay, I'll be brief then. Look, at the end of May, toward the end of May, a temporary agreement that the International Atomic Energy Agency made with Iran will expire, and Iran will erase footage from cameras which have been monitoring its nuclear activities. This will be very serious. We will lose this continuity of safeguards And it's a very serious matter. I mean, I read something crazy by Jim Woolsey saying Iran already had a bomb. You can imagine how the neocons and conspiracy theorists will go crazy if we don't have that footage. So there are some deadlines coming up, and Iran has some levers that it has employed and more that it can employ. I think the Biden administration, I hope they are working very assiduously behind the scenes to reach an agreement on how to sequence a return to compliance with the JCPOA, what steps each will take. Because I am concerned that a lot of this will begin to get out of hand, and that there are people in Iran who think that they have, to use a term that some strategists like, that they already have escalation dominance when it comes to the region and when it comes to their nuclear program. So I'm concerned, and I know a lot of the people who are in the Biden administration. They're great people. I have faith that they will do the right thing if they can, and I think we should all be supporting them against the Menendezes and the Grahams of this world, who will make trouble.
Well, thanks so much, and thank you all for joining us. I know how busy each one of you is, and I'm grateful and certainly don't take for granted the fact that you all decided to join us for this great conversation. I'm slightly more optimistic than our conversation reflected, in part because I agree with all of the concerns that we all have about the possibilities. But I think what we see outside, obviously, is always posturing. How much of this is going to be overtaken by events? I happen to think once a decision is made by the Biden administration, he's not going to face as much opposition as they think, because it's got so much. This idea that there are other priorities on the table is going to work in his favor, because no one is going to just jump on this issue so much when there are all these other issues to be preoccupied with. So I'll put that as a point of optimism into this conversation. But thank you so much for joining me. Thank you all for listening, those who signed on, and I'll look forward to seeing you in other opportunities in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shibli.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Valik.
Bye-bye.